Originally, I was going to do the last part of chapter 12, and then when I put the end of 12 and 13 together, I think there's a pair of stories here that have much to teach us, that complement each other. So I wonder if I could have a volunteer to read chapter 12, 10 to the end, and then someone else to read chapter 13. Anybody like to volunteer before I land on somebody from a long distance? Don't be shy.
I'm just going to see there's no big words in it.
Not particularly, no. Go on, Mary. You do chapter 12, 10 to the end, please. That would be great.
Oh, I bet there's no big words in it. No, just not. I hope not, anyway.
Not really. Sandra,
So
would you like to do 13
chapter 12.
13.
12.
Okay.
Yeah, Mary, 12, chapter 12, 10 to the end, and then Sandra, chapter 13. Thank you very much.
Chapter.
And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. And it came to pass that when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that they said unto Sarah, his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. And it came to pass that when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. And the princes of Pharaoh saw her, and commanded her before Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he entreated Abram well, and her sake. And he had sheep and oxen and axes, and manservants and maidservants, and she asses and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with a great plagues, because of Sarah's Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called and said, What is that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife? Why saidst thou, She is my sister, so that I might have taken her to me to wife? And now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had.
Thank you, Mary.
Then Abraham, how many verses do you want me to read? The whole chapter?
The whole chapter, please, Sandra, yes.
That's fine, yes. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, and silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar where he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they may dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord. like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever, and I will make you and your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants are also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land, through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Then Abraham moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord.
Thank you, Sandra. So here's the narrative we're going to follow this evening. And the way we're going to do this, and this will be a fairly standard procedure on Sunday evenings, is we're going to look at what I would call the drama, the actual storyline. Then we're going to look at behind the scenes. In other words, what's going on here, not just the drama being played out, what's going on behind the scenes spiritually, with God as the main player, of course. And we'll do that for each of these two little sections, and then we'll draw out some implications and applications for us, and that will hopefully provoke some questions and some study. Let me just remind you where we were last week. So if you look on that chart, where the cursor is, this is where we sort of finished last week with Abraham arriving in Canaan at the age of 75. And I'll remind you on a map, though, moving down to the south of what we would recognize as Canaan. And the story we're looking at this evening comes, we don't have a specific date. Obviously, it'll be fairly soon after. There's only 11 years from this point to this point. And so this evening, we're looking at the story of him going to Egypt and the separation from Lot. So it all takes place around about 290 BC, just to give you that in a time frame. Just to look at a map, I think it's always helpful to see where we are on a map. It often makes sense of things. So last week he started went up to Haran, where he sort of got sidetracked for a little while, and then moved down to Canaan, stopping first of all at Shechem. And then as we zoomed in on that, we saw that he moved from Shechem to between Bethel and Ai, which again comes into our story this evening. And then he moved down to the Negev, which is this area down at the south of Canaan. And it seems that he sort of lived a nomadic lifestyle around that area, probably moving around wherever he could find necessary water and pasture lands. And remember, he'd been promised the land, but the promise had not yet been fulfilled. He was still required on a day-to-day basis to live by faith and in dependence on God. So the story we're looking at this evening, I call it When Faith is Tested. And these two sections have two trials of faith that Abraham experiences. So first of all, at the end of chapter 12, a severe famine takes place in the land. And Abraham takes his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and he moves down to Egypt, which is off this map, but it's a distance of about 250 miles from where he's been living for this period of time. The Egyptians are polytheistic. They worship a whole number of different gods. They're very cruel and immoral. They have a terrible reputation. And Abraham quickly senses that there's danger for himself if Sarai is taken. He can't pretend that she's a servant, for then she would really be in great danger. They would treat her extremely badly. So he passes her off as his sister, which is a half-truth. Because if you remember, we noticed last week, and it comes in Genesis 20, that Sarai is the daughter of Nahor, Abraham's father, but from a different wife. Very common in those days. So Abraham tells a half-truth, really to save his own skin. And initially it works well because we're told here in verse 15 of chapter 12 that when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And so Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's harem. And we know also, look at verse 16, that he dealt well with Abraham, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels, on top of all that he'd acquired when he was in Haran, of course. Now, we don't know exactly how and when Abraham received all these possessions, but he certainly received some directly from the hand of Pharaoh. And we know that during his time in Egypt, his wealth increased considerably. But Pharaoh and his household are afflicted, verse 17, in an unspecified way. We're told with great plagues. Literally, it's with great strokes in the sense of afflictions by God. We're not told how Pharaoh managed to work out what was going on. How did he link the affliction with the fact that Sarai was actually Abraham's wife? All we know in verse 18 is that he challenged her about it. So whether God had somehow revealed it to her, we don't know. And so Sarai is returned to Abraham, and they're given an escort and sent away. And Sarah and Abraham, as we know the next verse, they head back up to the Negev area where they were before. Now just look behind the scenes of this for a moment. What strikes me about this passage is that God is absent. He's noticeable from this story by his absence, but also by his presence. What I mean by that is, when Abraham followed God's leading in traveling from Ur to Haran and then to Canaan, but there's no record of Abraham seeking God's guidance about going down to Egypt in the time of famine. There's no reference here to God leading Abraham. There's no reference to Abraham arriving in Egypt and building an altar to the Lord, which was his practice. In fact, in verses 10 to 16, there's no mention of God. So God is noticeable by his absence. And the Bible teaches us not only about what it says, but also sometimes about what it doesn't say. However, the record is explicit in saying the sufferings experienced by Pharaoh are at the Lord's hand. The second thing to notice here is that having come to Canaan by faith, Abraham's faith is now being tested by a famine. Now here's a test, you see. It's a test of God's provision. Having brought him here, would God provide for him? That's the question. God has brought him from Ur, a long, tortuous journey. He's brought him with family, with his increasing possessions. Is Abraham able to trust God that even in a famine, God can still provide for him? But Abraham fails the test. He goes down to Egypt. Now, in the Bible, to go down to Egypt is a spiritual reference as well as a geographical reference. To go down to Egypt means to doubt God's promises, to doubt God's faithfulness. If you like, to turn to the world for help. And on the surface, at first, it seems to work. Abraham is safe because Sarai is taken into the harem. He's loaded with more possessions and servants. He becomes even richer and more affluent. So on the surface, turning to the world seems to work, but it later causes all sorts of problems. When we look at the second little story in chapter 13, Abraham's possessions have now become so great and his herd so large that it causes friction and tension between him and his nephew. And also there's an even greater problem that's going to be saved up for us in weeks to come. Because you remember that in chapter 16, Sarai gives Abraham her maid, Hagar. And we know where that ended up in trouble. We're still living with it today in many ways, because that's the root of the whole Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, we're told that Hagar was an Egyptian. Almost certainly, they acquired Hagar, or Sarai acquired Hagar, while she was in Pharaoh's harem. And of course, she becomes the mother of Ishmael and all the Arab descendants. So you see, on the surface, going to the world works because you get more possessions, you get more protection, but you're storing up for yourselves trouble down the line. in both these two situations. But still, God keeps his covenant promise, and he prevents the line of, he preserves the line of the seed of promise. If God's promises to Abraham are going to be fulfilled, Sarai cannot become the wife of an Egyptian ruler. So God intervenes, and he overrules Abraham's and Sarai's scheming. So that's the first little story. Let's look at the second one. The first one was a test of faith failed. The second one is a test of faith passed. So Abraham and Sarai go up from Egypt, returning to the land of promise. And the record tells in chapter 13 that he comes up in and from the Negev, verse 3, as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. So he goes back to where he first made camp, as it were, where he built an altar to the Lord. So it's a symbolic return. He's back in fellowship with God, if we could use it like that. That's what the altar means. No reference to God, no altar in Abraham's experience, going to and while he's in Egypt. But now he's back in the land of promise. He's back at the place of an altar. And notice here, there's references here to the wealth and the possessions he's got. Verse 2, we're told he was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. Verse 5, Lot, who went with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents, so the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great they could not dwell together, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. It's an interesting word in verse 2, where it says he was very rich. Literally, it says he was very heavy in livestock. It's a weighty thing. It's actually the same word that's the root word for the word holy. It's a lovely Hebrew word, kabod, and it's weight, and says a W-E-I-G-H-T. And God is weighty because he's glorious and holy. And Abraham was weighty in possessions. But tensions arise between these two camps because of their livestock, and there would be limited pasture land. And also verse 7, the problem is worse because the indigenous tribes of the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land. Then notice what Abraham does. And he demonstrates great generosity and magnanimity and wisdom. Remember, he's the older, he's the uncle. And he's the one to whom God has promised so much. So he could have stood on his seniority and said to Lot, well, okay, we can't stay together, but I'm going to take this piece of land and you can have what I leave you. But no, he insists on Lot making the choice. And the language in verses 8 to 9 is actually much stronger than the ESV allows. There's a courtesy in Abraham's word. Literally, he says, please, or I entreat you, or I pray, I beg you, I plead with you. He's not just saying, go for it. He's actually graciously asking him, pleading with him to take the initiative here. And look what Lot does. Verse 10, he lifts up his eyes and he sees that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere. And he sees it to the east, and he sees an area stretching south from Jericho all the way down to the land of Zoar. Now, if you could look on the map here just for a moment and watch my cursor, just to show you, here's Jericho here. So Lot is looking eastward, so he's looking at this piece of land here. But gradually his sight broadens, his horizon stretch, and Zoar is right down here at the bottom of the Salt Sea. And this is the area, for example, probably where Sodom and Gomorrah was. So it's not just that Lot was looking, just over the next field. He was looking a long, long way south. This is a distance, if I remember rightly, of about 50 or 60 miles. Now, you can't obviously see all that, but over a period of time, his sight moves, his vision broadens. And of course, he ends up, the more he sees, he gets, as it were, greedy, and he moves south until he settles here in the area of where Sodom and Gomorrah was. But what's attracting him is the fertile land. It's the vegetation, it's the possibilities. And so they separated this particular time, and Lot, verse 12, settled among the cities of the valley, which is this whole area down here. He settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So gradually he's moving south towards Sodom. And that, of course, because we know what's going to come, that's ringing alarm bells in our heads. And the men of Sodom were wicked, we're told, great sinners against the Lord. Warren Weirs has an interesting comment in his commentary. He's got a very helpful way of saying this. He says, first Lot looked towards Sodom, then he moved towards Sodom, and finally he moved into Sodom. It was a gradual process, but he knew where he was going. And then when he's gone, God speaks to Abram, verse 14, and says to Abram, do what Lot did, lift up your eyes. You see the language? Verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes. Verse 14, God says to Abram, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are. And don't just look eastward, look northward and southward and eastward and westward. Now just think about that for a moment. And God says to Abram, everything you see is yours. That includes the land that Lot has chosen. Because the land that Lot has chosen, this whole area here, is part of the promise God made to Abraham in the first place. I will give all this land to you. So Abraham looks with faith, and he's actually lost nothing. He's given, in inverted commas, land to Lot, but he hasn't lost it because it's still part of the covenant promise God made to him. And he's got more than what he gave to Lot. He's looking east, north, south, and west. And more than that, God says to Abraham, go and verse 17, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. Enjoy it. And wherever you put your feet, it's yours. And we're told in verse 18, Abraham moved his tent. Literally, it says he tented. So, and it implies an ongoing process in obedience to God's command. And we're told in verse 18 that he settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. And this is going to become his base camp now for quite a period of time, as we'll see in coming studies. And the altar would not only have been a place of personal worship, but it would also be a visible testimony to the peoples around. Remember, these are pagan nations. And Abraham is putting a marker down and saying, I am a worshiper of Yahweh. I'm not involved in your pagan worship. So he's tested. His test is this. God has promised him all this land. Can he risk effectively giving some of it away outside his control? And he passes the test. He takes initiative. He says to Lot, it's yours. Take what you want. But deep in his heart, he's reassured by God, you've not lost it, because I've promised it to you and to your descendants. There's a couple of behind the scenes comments here. This little story begins and ends with references to Abraham worshiping God. And one of the ways the Hebrew people wrote was, I forget the technical term now, but I call it bookending. They begin and end a story, so that tells us that's a story, but they begin and end it with the same thing. So it begins with an altar and it ends with an altar. So it reminds us that between those bookends, Abraham is living and acting in the context of a living, trusting relationship with God. And because Abraham takes a step of faith, from verse 14, God repeats and expands the promise that we saw last week back in chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And this promise is going to be repeated and expanded 2 or 3 more times. And each time the detail gets a bit more. So this episode is all about Abraham exercising faith in God to bring about his promises, even when he's prepared to give away much of what God had promised him. And comparisons are being drawn here between the life lived by sight, which is the life of Lot, and the life lived by faith, the life of Abraham. So he's tested in God's provision for him, and he fails that test. on this occasion. He's tested on God's promise to him, and he gloriously passes that test. And as a result, God renews and restates his covenant promises to him. Now, let me just throw out a couple of application points here that I hope will provoke maybe some questions or some discussion that will help us in our working through all this. Real faith will always be tested. Got one quote I had many years ago, and I don't remember the source was, a faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. If your faith is real, be certain that God will test it from time to time. Sometimes himself, and sometimes he will allow Satan to test us in our faith. That's what happened to Job, wasn't it? God was confident that Job could be tested by Satan because God knew Job's faith in him. Peter, in his New Testament letters, compares the Christian life to the testing of gold in the furnace. And God's purpose in trials and testing is not only to verify our faith, but it's to purify our faith. And like Peter's analogy, as the faith is put into the furnace, the dross is burned away and the gold is left, all the more pure. So God knows what kind of faith we have, but we don't know. So he tests us, not to tell him any information, he knows the information, but to reveal the information to us. And two practical lessons here. Number one, great triumphs are often followed by great tests. Abraham had this great triumph. He'd come into Canaan. He'd proved God's faithfulness in bringing him there. He'd settled in the land that God had told him to come to. And almost immediately as a test, and he fails it. And we need to be very careful that when we have moments of great triumph in our Christian lives, if you like, a sort of mountaintop experience, or we know some victory or some great joy, that's the moment where we need to be particularly careful, because very often, right round the corner, there's a great trial coming. I mean, so when you read Ephesians 6, for example, the teaching about spiritual warfare, Paul tells us that, and having done all, having put on the armor and having fought the battle, having done all, stand. Don't sit down. Don't take the armor off, because the chances are there's another battle coming around the corner. And let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So God will bring and allow trials in our life, and they often come after a time of triumph. And when a trial comes, the question we need to ask is not, how can I get out of this? The question needs to be, what can I get out of this? Isn't that an important difference? Not how can I get out of this, but if this trial has come to me, as I believe it has by the sovereign hand of my Father, then he's trying to teach me something. He's trying to reveal something to my heart about my faith. So I shouldn't try and get out of the trial. I should ask myself, what can I get out of it? The second lesson we learn here, particularly from the first incident we looked at, is what happens when you stop trusting and you start scheming. So Abraham went to Egypt. He had no altar that we know of. We don't find him calling on God for guidance and help. The problem is he begins to scheme. He works out a strategy for himself. And everything he received in Egypt later caused trouble. His wealth increased so he couldn't coexist with Lot. He brings an Egyptian handmaid servant into his family, and thus just ends up with disastrous consequences. And we must be very careful that we don't kid ourselves that we may have schemed and things seem to have worked out. We got the result we wanted, but we may actually like to have stored up trouble for ourselves that will begin to reveal themselves later. And we know another level of that, because you know that when Sarai gives Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to Abraham as a wife in order to have a child, that that scheming, that trying to give God a helping hand, becomes catastrophic in its consequences very quickly. So true faith will be tested. Here the test is in God's provision and in God's promises. The first one, Abraham failed, and the second one, he gloriously passed, and God renewed his promises to him. Now let me just for a moment